Sometimes the greatest strength comes from our deepest wounds. Sometimes what the world calls a disability becomes our most powerful gift. In the frozen lands of the north, a blind Viking warrior named Freya has learned to fight without her eyes. 5 winters ago, raiders took her sight, but awakened something stronger. Now she tracks enemies by their heartbeat and moves through battle like a shadow. The most feared wolf in all the northern lands has just escaped captivity. Fenrik is a legendary beast whose howl brings terror to entire villages. He has killed countless warriors and destroyed whole settlements. When this ancient wolf meets Freya, something unexpected happens. The encounter changes everything she believes about monsters and enemies. What does the most feared wolf of the north do when it meets a blind warrior who fights like the gods themselves? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants as Freya made her way through the village of Ironhold. Her bare feet knew every stone of the ancient path, every root that dared to break through the packed earth. The worn ash staff in her right hand tapped a steady rhythm against the ground, not the desperate searching of someone lost, but the confident stride of a hunter who had learned to see with more than eyes. The bloodstone pendant at her throat caught the early light, its deep red surface warming against her skin. It had been her mother's, passed down through 3 generations of warrior women, and now it rested against the heart of perhaps the most unlikely warrior of them all. The weight of it reminded her daily of the legacy she carried, the expectations that pressed down like the mountain snow above their valley. Shadow Walker rises with the sun again, called a familiar voice from beside. The blacksmith's forge. Elder Bjorn's weathered hands never paused in their work, but she could hear the smile in his voice. The rhythmic clang of hammer against steel had guided her steps since childhood, a beacon as reliable as the North Star. "The shadows never sleep, old man," Freya replied, allowing herself a rare smile. "Neither should their walker." Bjorn set down his hammer and wiped sweat from his brow, despite the morning chill. "Aye, but even shadows need rest. You've been pushing harder these past weeks. The nightmares again?" Freya's grip tightened on her staff. The dreams had been coming more frequently, visions of fire and blood, of massive shapes moving through smoke, of a presence both terrible and familiar calling to her across an impossible distance. But she wouldn't burden the old smith with such things. "Just keeping sharp," she said instead. "A blade that sits idle grows dull. And a blade worked too hard grows brittle," Bjorn countered. His footsteps approached, leather boots scuffing against the stone. "Your father would have said the same." The mention of her father sent a familiar ache through her chest. Ragnar the Bold had been the finest warrior in 3 clans, a man whose presence could fill a hall and whose absence still echoed 5 years after his death. He had begun training her before she could properly hold a sword, teaching her that strength came not from the arm but from the heart, not from what you could see but from what you could understand. "He would have told me to trust my instincts," Freya said, "and my instincts tell me something is coming." Before Bjorn could respond, the sound of running feet approached. Young Eirik's breathing was labored, his heartbeat elevated from more than just exertion. Fear tinged his scent like bitter herbs. "Freya," he gasped, skidding to a stop before her. "Elder Magnus calls for the war council. Riders from the eastern passes, they bring news of the Wolf King's escape." The Wolf King. Even spoken in daylight, the name carried weight like a thundercloud. Freya had heard the stories since childhood, tales of a beast larger than any natural wolf, with eyes like winter storms and jaws that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell. For 3 generations, the creature had haunted the northern territories, leaving behind only bones and terror. "When did this happen?" Freya asked, her mind already racing ahead to implications and preparations. 2 days past," Eirik replied. "The Iron Hand clan had him caged at their stronghold, meant to use him against their enemies. But he broke free during the new moon, killed a dozen warriors, and vanished into the deep forests. Bjorn spat into the forge fire, making it hiss. Fools! You don't cage a legend and expect it to stay put. The Iron Hand always were too clever for their own good. Freya said nothing, but her mind was working. The Iron Hand clan controlled the mountain passes to the east, the traditional hunting grounds where game was plentiful, and the old sacred sites lay hidden beneath centuries of snow. If the Wolf King had escaped into that territory, he would be moving toward our lands, she whispered. Aye, Eirik confirmed. The council fears he'll come here next. The old stories say he returns every 7 years to the place of his first hunt, the place where my mother died. Freya finished. The silence that followed was heavy with shared memory. Astrid the Fierce had led a hunting party 21 years ago, tracking what they thought was merely a large but ordinary wolf. Only one man had returned, barely alive. Speaking of a creature that moved like liquid shadow and struck like lightning from Odin's own hand. They had found Astrid's body 3 days later, her sword still clutched in her hand, surrounded by the corpses of 6 warriors. The council waits, Eirik said gently. Freya nodded and began walking toward the great hall, her staff tapping its steady rhythm. Behind her, she heard Bjorn return to his forge, but the strikes came slower now, more deliberate. Even the village's heartbeat seemed to have changed, tension singing in the air like a bowstring drawn too tight. The great hall of Ironhold had been built by her grandfather's grandfather, its massive timber frame hewn from trees that had stood since the world was young. Inside, the long tables had been pushed aside to make room for the war council, and the fire pit blazed high enough to chase away the morning chill. 23 souls had gathered, every adult of fighting age, plus the elders whose wisdom outweighed their failing strength. Freya found her place in the circle without guidance, her enhanced hearing picking up the subtle shifts in breathing and heartbeat that told her where each person sat. To her left, Elder Magnus cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the hall like distant thunder. "The matter before us needs no pretty words," Magnus began. "The Wolf King walks free, and if the old tales hold true, his path leads here. We must decide, do we stand and fight, or do we take our families and herds and seek shelter with our allies to the south? Run?" The voice belonged to Torvald the Red, whose scarred hands had never known retreat. "From a beast? My grandfather's grandfather fought bears with nothing but a spear and his courage." "Your grandfather's grandfather never faced this particular beast," replied Magnus dryly. "The Wolf King is no ordinary creature. The stories are just stories," interrupted Helga Ironarm, the eldest of the Shield Maidens, grown larger with each telling. "A wolf is a wolf, no matter its size." Freya listened to the debate swirl around her, hearing the fear beneath the brave words, the uncertainty that no amount of bluster could disguise. She had heard these same arguments after her father's death, when raiders from the south had threatened their borders. The village had been ready to scatter then too, until she had proven that a blind warrior could fight as well as any sighted one. "What does our Shadow Walker think?" Magnus asked, and the hall fell silent. All eyes turned to her, she knew, though she could not see them. Instead, she felt their attention like warmth from the fire, heavy with expectation and doubt in equal measure. Some still saw her as Ragnar's daughter, worthy of respect for her bloodline. Others saw only a broken woman playing at being whole. A few, precious few, saw her for what she truly was. "I think," Freya said slowly, "that we are asking the wrong question." She stood, her staff gripped firmly in both hands. "We debate whether to run or fight, but we have not asked why the Wolf King was caged in the first place. The Ironhand clan are not beast tamers or sorcerers. They are raiders and killers. What did they want with a legend?" Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Magnus stroked his grey beard thoughtfully. "You think there is more to this than simple escape?" "I think the Wolf King's freedom was not an accident," Freya replied. "And I think we will not understand the true threat until we understand his purpose." Pretty words, growled Torval, but they do not change the fact that a killer stalks our lands. Whether by accident or design, he comes. What do you propose we do about it? Freya turned toward his voice, her sightless eyes seeming to look directly at him. I propose to hunt him. The hall erupted in voices, some shocked, some angry, some admiring. Magnus raised his hand for silence, but it took long moments for the noise to die away. Alone? Magnus asked when quiet returned. If necessary. Freya, said a gentle voice from across the circle. Ingrid the wise, keeper of the old stories and tender of the sick. Child, your courage honors your father's memory, but this creature has killed warriors twice your size and half your age. What makes you think that I can succeed where they failed? Freya finished. Perhaps nothing. But I know things about hunting that others do not. I know how to track by sound and scent, how to move without sight, how to fight by instinct rather than vision. The Wolf King may be a legend, but legends bleed like anything else. She paused, feeling the weight of their attention, the mixture of hope and skepticism that hung in the air like smoke from the fire. And I know something else, she continued. I know that running from a legend only makes it grow stronger. But if someone stands against it, if someone proves it can be faced and defeated, then it becomes just another story told around the fire. The silence stretched long enough for the logs to settle in the fire pit, sending sparks dancing up toward the smoke hole. Finally, Magnus spoke. The council will consider your proposal, he said formally. But know this, Freya Ragnarsdottir, if you undertake this hunt, you go with our blessing but not our expectation. No one will think less of you if you choose another path. Freya nodded and resumed her seat, but inside, her decision was already made. The Wolf King was coming, drawn by forces she did not yet understand, but could feel stirring in her blood, like the tide responding to the moon. When he arrived, she would be ready. As the council dissolved into smaller groups, planning evacuation routes and defensive preparations, Freya slipped away from the hall. Outside, the morning mist had burned off, leaving the sky clear and sharp as new-forged steel. She could smell snow on the wind, winter's promise carried down from the high peaks where legends were born and heroes were tested. Her fingers found the bloodstone pendant at her throat, feeling its familiar weight and warmth. Soon, very soon, she would discover whether she was worthy of the legacy it represented or whether she would become just another story told around the fire, a cautionary tale about the blind girl who thought she could see. The iron collar lay twisted and broken in. The mud, its metal edges still sharp enough to draw blood. Freya knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the crude welds and scratches that told a story of captivity and rage. The scent of fear lingered here, not the wolf's fear, but that of his captors. Terror so pure it had soaked into the very earth. 3 days, she murmured, calculating the time since the escape. The trail was still fresh enough to follow, if she moved quickly. Eirik shifted nervously behind her, his leather armor creaking with each anxious movement. Freya, perhaps we should return to the village. Gather more warriors, plan a proper hunt. By the time we organize a war party, he will be gone, she replied, standing and brushing the dirt from her knees. The Wolf King does not wait for our convenience. The broken collar had been discovered by hunters that morning, half a day's journey from Ironhold's borders. With it came the first real evidence that the legends were more than mere stories. The metal was thick as a man's thumb, forged by master smiths and reinforced with iron bands. Whatever had broken free from this restraint possessed strength beyond mortal understanding. Around the collar, the ground told its own tale. Massive paw prints pressed deep into the soft earth, each one larger than Freya's outstretched hand. Claw marks scored the nearby trees, gouged so deep that sap still wept from the wounds. And everywhere, the lingering scent of something wild and ancient, a musk that spoke of deep forests and older magics. The council will not approve, Eirik said, though his voice lacked conviction. They expect you to wait for their decision. Freya shouldered her pack, checking that her weapons were secure. Her sword, inherited from her father, rode familiar against her hip. Her CX, the long knife that had been her first blade, hung ready at her left side. Across her back, a recurved bow of horn and sinew, strung that morning with her finest arrows. The council debates. "While a legend walks free in our lands," she said, "some decisions cannot wait for committee." She had spent the night in preparation, gathering supplies and steeling her resolve. Her pack held dried meat, hard bread, and a skin of ale enough for a week in the wilderness. More importantly, it contained the tools of her trade, lengths of thin rope, a fire steel and tinder, and the small iron hooks she used for tracking by touch. But it was the final item that gave her pause. Wrapped in soft leather and tucked deep in her pack was a silver amulet, a wolf's head worked in intricate detail. It had belonged to her mother, worn during the hunt that claimed her life. The village wise woman insisted it held protective power, though protection had failed Astrid when she needed it most. "If you will not return to seek the council's blessing," Eirik said carefully, "then at least allow me to accompany you. 2 blades are better than 1. Freya turned toward him, her expression gentle but firm. "Your courage honors you, Eirik, but this is not your burden. Return to the village. Help them prepare defenses in case I fail. And if you do not return?" The question hung between them like morning mist, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. Freya had faced death before in training accidents, during border skirmishes, in the daily dance between survival and disaster that defined life in the northern lands. But this felt different. This felt like destiny reaching out with clawed hands to claim what had been promised long ago. "Then remember me as someone who chose to act rather than hide," she said finally, "and pray to whatever gods will listen that someone else proves braver than I was wise." Eirik clasped her shoulder, his grip firm and warm. "The village will sing your name regardless, Freya Ragnarsdottir. Of that you can be certain." After he left, making his reluctant way back toward Ironhold, Freya stood alone beside the broken collar. The forest stretched ahead of her, vast and untamed, holding secrets older than human memory. Somewhere in those depths a legend waited. Whether it waited as hunter or hunted remained to be seen. She began to walk, following the trail that only she could read. The Wolf King's passage had disturbed more than just the physical world. Birds still avoided this area, and small creatures had fled to safer grounds. Even the wind seemed different here, carrying whispers of something wild and dangerous. The tracks led northeast, toward the old-growth forests that crowned the mountain slopes. This was where the ancient stories placed the wolf's original hunting grounds, where the first villagers had learned to fear the darkness between the trees. If the legends held true, he was going home. As she walked, Freya's enhanced senses painted a picture no sighted person could match. Her ears caught the distant call of ravens, the rustle of leaves that spoke of weather changes to come. Her nose detected the lingering scent trail, overlaid with the 1,000 other smells of a living forest. Most importantly, her skin felt the subtle changes in air pressure and temperature that told her of obstacles ahead, dangers to avoid, safe paths to follow. The morning passed in steady travel, her feet finding sure purchase on slopes that would challenge an ordinary walker. The Wolf King's trail never wavered, driving straight toward some distant goal with the confidence of absolute knowledge. Whatever forces guided his steps, uncertainty was not among them. It was near midday when she found the first body. The Iron Hand warrior had died badly, his death written in the torn earth and scattered armor. Freya knelt beside the remains, reading the story with fingertips that had learned to see violence in its aftermath. The man had been running when death found him, fear driving him toward the false safety of thick undergrowth. It had not been enough. Fighting a legend with ordinary courage, she murmured, "A prayer for the dead." "Rest well, warrior. Your sacrifice teaches what mere steel cannot match." 3 more bodies lay scattered along the trail, each telling the same story of brave men undone by forces beyond their understanding. The Wolf King had not hunted them. This was not predation but elimination, the cold efficiency of a killer removing obstacles from his path. The last warrior had made it furthest, nearly a quarter-mile beyond his companions. His sword lay beside him, its blade notched and bloody. Whatever else could be said of the Iron Hand clan, their warriors did not die easily. Freya studied the weapon, noting the damage patterns. The wolf had tested himself against human steel and found it wanting, but not without cost. Dark stains on the ground spoke of spilled blood, not all of it human. "So you can be hurt," she said to the wind. "Good to know." The trail continued beyond the killing ground, but now it carried a different character. The Wolf King's steps came more heavily, his gait slightly irregular. Pain or weariness, perhaps both. Even legends, it seemed, paid a price for their victories. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Freya realized she was no longer following just a trail. The wolf was leading her somewhere specific, guiding her deeper into wilderness that had known no human footstep for generations. Ancient trees rose around her like pillars in some forgotten temple, their canopy so thick that only scattered rays of sunlight reached the forest floor. Here, in this cathedral of living wood, the old magic still lingered. She could feel it in the way sound carried, how scents seemed stronger, and colors, even to her sightless eyes, more vivid. This was a place where legends were born, where the line between myth and reality grew thin as morning mist. The Wolf King's trail led deeper still, toward something that called to both hunter and hunted with equal strength. Freya followed, her staff tapping against roots, older than kingdoms, her heart steady, despite the growing certainty that she walked toward a confrontation that would define the rest of her days. Behind her, the familiar world of villages and councils faded into memory. Ahead lay the proving ground, where a blind woman would discover whether courage alone could stand against living legend. The broken iron collar had been just the beginning. The ancient bone compass trembled in Freya's palm, its carved surface warm despite the deepening cold of the mountain forest. She had found it in her mother's belongings years ago, dismissing it as mere decoration. Now, as supernatural forces stirred around her, the mystical navigation tool pulsed with subtle life, its needle pointing not to magnetic north, but toward something far more elusive. The deeper she traveled into the Wolf King's domain, the more the natural world seemed to bend around his presence. Trees grew at impossible angles, their trunks twisted as if seeking to avoid some ancient wound in the earth. The very air tasted different here, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle and her enhanced senses sing with warnings she could not quite interpret. Freya paused beside a massive oak whose bark bore scratches too deliberate to be accidental. Running her fingers along the gouges, she felt a pattern emerge, not random claw marks, but something approaching script, as if the Wolf King had left messages for those with eyes to read them. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered to the silent forest. The compass needle swung sharply eastward, and she felt, rather than heard, something massive moving through the underbrush ahead, not approaching parallel to her path, maintaining distance while acknowledging her presence. The Wolf King knew she followed. Perhaps he had known from the moment she took up his trail. This realization should have filled her with fear. Instead, she found herself oddly comforted. A mindless beast would have attacked by now, driven by hunger or territorial instinct. But this creature was choosing its ground carefully, leading her toward some specific destination. The question was whether she walked toward confrontation or trap. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating a forest floor carpeted with leaves that rustled with secrets. Freya's bare feet found purchase on roots slick with moisture, her staff probing ahead for obstacles that might slow her pace. Every step took her further from the familiar world of human concerns and deeper into a realm where older laws held sway. Her pack felt heavier now, not from physical weight but from the gravity of what she carried. Each item had been chosen for this moment: her father's sword, her mother's amulet, provisions that might sustain her in whatever trial lay ahead. But most importantly, the compass continued its steady guidance, pulling her toward a destiny she could not see, but increasingly could not avoid. A stream crossed her path, its waters running black beneath the forest canopy. The Wolf King's tracks marked the muddy bank on both sides, but here they were joined by something else, boot prints, human-made, but strangely proportioned. Too large for any warrior she knew, with a gait that spoke of someone moving with predatory grace rather than human stride. Freya knelt by the water's edge, her fingers tracing the mixed trail. The boot prints were fresh, perhaps only hours old. Someone else walked these woods, someone who traveled alongside the Wolf King rather than hunting him. The implications sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She filled her water skin from the stream, noting how the liquid seemed unusually clear despite its dark appearance. Mountain water often played tricks with light and shadow, but this felt different, as if the stream itself existed partially in the physical world and partially in something else entirely. Rising to continue her journey, Freya became aware of a subtle change in the forest's rhythm. The birds had fallen silent, and even the ever-present whisper of wind through leaves had stilled. In that unnatural quiet, she heard something that made her blood freeze, the distant sound of a wolf's howl, impossibly deep and resonant, echoing off the mountain peaks like the voice of winter itself. But beneath that obvious call lay something else, a harmonic that spoke to parts of her consciousness she rarely acknowledged. The howl carried words, or perhaps emotions so complex they transcended language. Loneliness, ancient and profound. Rage that had burned so long it had transformed into something approaching sorrow. And underneath it all, recognition, as if the Wolf King knew exactly who followed his trail and welcomed her presence for reasons she could not fathom. The compass needle spun wildly for a moment before settling on a new bearing, pulling her toward higher ground where the trees grew sparse and the sky opened above the forest canopy. Whatever waited for her lay in that direction, beyond the protective embrace of the ancient woods. As she climbed, following a path that seemed carved by something larger than human hands, Freya's thoughts turned to the stories she had heard as a child. Her mother had spoken of the Wolf King in whispers, treating him not as mere monster, but as something approaching a force of nature, dangerous but not inherently evil, like a winter storm or avalanche that destroyed without malice. He was not always what he is now, Astrid had said during one of their last conversations before the fatal hunt. The old stories speak of a time when he walked on two legs and bore a human name, but that was long ago, before the great betrayal, before the curse that bound him to fur and fang. At the time, Freya had dismissed such talk as superstition, the kind of romantic nonsense that made heroes out of monsters and tragedies, out of simple predation. Now, following the Wolf King's deliberately laid trail through a forest that bent to his will, she wondered if her mother had known more than she had ever shared. The path leveled out on a ridge that offered the first clear view she had enjoyed all day. Though her eyes could not see the vista, her other senses painted a picture of vast wilderness stretching to the horizon, an ocean of green broken by granite peaks that scraped the belly of the sky. This was the edge of human influence, where maps failed and legends took root in reality. Here, the Wolf King's trail split. One set of tracks continued along the ridge toward what her nose told her was a distant glacier. The other descended into a valley where strange scents suggested the presence of something that was neither fully natural nor entirely supernatural. The compass needle pointed down into the valley, but its trembling had increased to an almost violent shaking. Whatever lay in that direction was powerful enough to disrupt even mystical navigation. Freya chose the valley path, trusting in tools older than her understanding. As she descended, the air grew warmer despite the elevation, and she caught the first hints of wood smoke on the wind. Someone had built a fire in the valley below, someone who feared neither the Wolf King nor the isolation of these ancient mountains. The realization that she was not alone in this quest should have brought comfort. Instead, it filled her with a growing sense that she walked into a web of purposes and intentions far more complex than a simple hunt. The Wolf King's escape had set forces in motion that reached beyond the breaking of iron collars and the death of guards. As darkness began to gather in the forest depths, Freya pressed forward, guided by compass and instinct, toward whatever revelation waited in the valley ahead. Behind her, the familiar world continued its ordinary concerns. Before her lay the testing ground, where legends were either proven or destroyed. The fire had burned low to embers when Freya first caught sight of the figure sitting beside it. Not sight in the traditional sense, her eyes remained as sightless as ever, but the heat signature and the way the smoke moved told her of someone small and still, waiting with the patience of stone. "Come forward, daughter of Astrid," called a voice like autumn leaves rustling in wind. "I have been expecting you since the moon turned dark." Freya approached cautiously, her staff testing the ground ahead. The voice belonged to a woman, elderly by the tremor in her speech, but there was strength beneath the age, the kind of strength that came from knowledge rather than muscle. "You know who I am," Freya said, more statement than question. "I knew your mother before you were born, child. I knew your grandmother before that. The bloodline of the wise women is not easily forgotten, even when it takes unexpected forms." The woman for woman she was, Freya could tell now from scent and breath, and the way she moved stirred the fire with a long stick, sending sparks dancing into the night air. "I am Magna," she continued. "Some call me seer, others call me witch. I prefer to think of myself as someone who remembers what others choose to forget." Freya settled herself across the fire, noting how the flames seemed to burn with colors that painted themselves across her inner vision. This was no ordinary fire, just as this was no ordinary encounter. The bone compass in her pack had grown warm enough to feel through the leather, responding to whatever power emanated from the ancient woman. "You've been following the Wolf King's trail," Magna said, and it was not a question. "But do you understand what you truly follow? A legend that has escaped captivity and threatens my people," Freya replied carefully. Magna's laughter was like the sound of distant bells, beautiful but somehow sad. "Oh, child, your mother was wiser, though wisdom did not save her in the end. She understood that some legends are not what they appear to be." The seer reached into a pouch at her side and withdrew something that caught the firelight, a smooth black stone covered in symbols that seemed to shift and dance. When Freya tried to focus on them, the runestone radiated an energy that made her enhanced senses sing with harmonics she had never experienced. "Take this," Magna said, extending the stone toward her. "When the time comes for truth to be revealed, you will know how to use it." Freya accepted the runestone, feeling its weight heavier than any stone should be, as if it contained more than mere rock. The moment it touched her palm, images flashed behind her sightless eyes. A great wolf running beneath starlight, a warrior in chains, a choice that would determine the fate of more than just her village. "What am I seeing?" she whispered. "Possibilities," Magna replied. "The future is not fixed, daughter of Astrid. It bends and flows like water, shaped by the choices we make and the courage we find when darkness closes around us." "Tell me about the Wolf King," Freya said. "My mother spoke of him as more than just a beast." Magna poked at the fire again, and the flames flared higher, casting dancing shadows that seemed to take on lives of their own. "Long ago, before your grandmother's grandmother drew breath, there was a prince named Fenrik. He was everything a Viking lord should be: strong, brave, honorable to a fault. But he had a brother, Grim, whose heart was black with envy and whose soul thirsted for power." The seer's voice took on the cadence of the old storytellers, weaving words that painted pictures in the darkness. When their father died, the kingdom should have passed to Fenrik as the elder son. But Grim had learned darker arts, made bargains with forces that should never be trusted. On the night of the succession, he worked a curse of terrible power not to kill his brother, for that would have been too simple, but to transform him into the very thing their people feared most. Freya felt the runestone grow warm in her palm as understanding began to dawn. The Wolf King is not a beast at all. He is a man trapped in wolf form, cursed to wander the northern lands for 21 years, Magna confirmed. The curse can only be broken under specific conditions, and only by one who sees with more than eyes. Someone like me, Freya said quietly, perhaps. Or perhaps you are simply the instrument through which his true purpose will be fulfilled. The prophecies speak of a final confrontation, a choice between vengeance and redemption. Your mother tried to break the curse but lacked the wisdom to see beyond the surface. She saw only a monster where she should have seen a victim. The fire crackled and sparked, and in those sparks Freya thought she could see faces her mother, her father, her warriors, long dead and battles yet to be fought. The runestone pulsed with each beat of her heart, as if it were slowly synchronizing with her life force. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "What do you gain from helping me?" Magna was quiet for so long that Freya wondered if the old woman had fallen asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of regret. "Because I was the one who taught Grim the curse. In my pride and foolishness, I thought I was helping a young man claim his rightful inheritance. I did not see the darkness in his heart until it was too late. For 21 years, I have watched an innocent man suffer for my mistake. Perhaps, through you, I can finally make amends." The confession hung in the air between them, like smoke from the dying fire. Freya understood now why the bone compass had led her here, why the runestone felt so right in her hand. This was not coincidence but destiny, the slow working of forces that had been set in motion before her birth. "What must I do?" she asked. "Follow your heart, daughter of Astrid. The runestone, it will guide you when the time comes, but the choice and the courage to make it must be yours alone." Magna rose from beside the fire, moving with surprising grace for one so advanced in years. "Rest now. Tomorrow you will face trials that will test more than your skill with blade and bow. And remember, sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating your enemy, but from understanding why they became your enemy in the first place." The seer melted back into the darkness as silently as she had appeared, leaving Freya alone with the dying fire and the weight of terrible knowledge. The Wolf King was not her enemy, but her burden, a cursed prince whose redemption might cost more than she was prepared to pay. In her hand, the runestone pulsed with patient power, waiting for the moment when wisdom and courage would be tested in equal measure. The massive tree dominated the clearing like a cathedral spire, its trunk scarred by claw marks that told a story of rage and desperation. Each gouge was deeper than Freya's hand could reach, carved with such force that the ancient oak still wept amber tears 21 years later. This was Fenrik's territory marker, a boundary between the mortal world and something far older. As she approached the scarred giant, Freya felt the air itself change. The temperature dropped by degrees that had nothing to do with altitude or season, and her breath began to mist despite the afternoon warmth. The runestone in her pack grew cold against her ribs, as if responding to energies that opposed its own mystical nature. "So you have entered my domain," rumbled a voice from the shadows beyond the tree. Freya's hand moved instinctively to her sword hilt, then stopped. The voice was deep enough to rattle her bones, but beneath its bestial growl lay something unmistakably human: intelligence, pain, and a weariness that spoke of decades spent in forms not meant for mortal souls. "I seek the Wolf King," she said, her voice steady, despite the supernatural presence pressing against her consciousness. "I have words that need speaking." A massive shape moved between the trees, visible to her enhanced senses as a disturbance in air currents and a warmth that registered against her skin. When it stepped into the clearing, even her blindness could not diminish the impact of its presence. Fenrik stood easily as tall as a horse at the shoulder, his fur the color of winter storms, his eyes, she could feel their weight upon her, carrying the accumulated sorrow of 2 decades. "Most who seek me bring steel and fire," the wolf said, settling onto his haunches with surprising grace. "You bring only questions. Why?" Freya removed the runestone from her pack, feeling its surface warm at the proximity to its intended target. Because I have learned that the right questions matter more than the sharpest blade. Magna the seer sends her regards and her regrets. The great head tilted, and for a moment she glimpsed the man beneath the curse, intelligent, noble, bearing his burden with a dignity that 21 years of torment could not break. Magna, Fenrik said, and the name carried layers of meaning. So she still lives, still seeks to balance scales that can never be made even. She told me what you truly are, Freya said, what was done to you, the choice that was stolen by your brother's ambition. A sound escaped the wolf that might have been laughter in another throat. And what do you propose to do with such dangerous knowledge, blind warrior? Do you think to succeed where your mother failed? The mention of Astrid sent a spike of pain through Freya's chest, but she had expected this conversation eventually. My mother saw a monster where she should have seen a victim, but she also saw something else, a threat to our people that had to be stopped. Tell me, Prince Fenrik, how many innocents have died by your claws? The silence stretched long enough for wind to stir the scarred leaves above them. When Fenrik finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. Fewer than you might think, more than I can bear. He rose and began to pace, his massive form moving with restless energy. The curse binds me to hunt, but it does not control my choice of prey. I have killed warriors who threatened the innocent, raiders who burned villages, men whose hearts were already dark with cruelty. But I have also killed those who stood in my way when the blood hunger grew too strong to resist. Freya listened to the admission, hearing the self-loathing beneath the words. This was not the confession of a monster, but of a man forced to become something he despised, making choices between degrees of evil when no good options remained. Your mother came to me 21 years ago, Fenrik continued. She offered to break the curse, claimed she had found a way. But when the moment came for truth, she could not see past the wolf to find the man. Her blade sought my heart when it should have sought my redemption, and you killed her for it. I defended myself against someone who would have murdered me rather than save me, Fenrik corrected. Gently, the difference matters, though it brings no comfort to either of us. Freya felt tears she had not shed for years, threatened to break free. Her mother had died, trying to be a hero, unable to see beyond surface appearances to deeper truths. It was a failing that ran in their bloodline, the tendency to act with courage before tempering it with wisdom. The curse nears its end, Fenrik said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 21 years of winter nights, and I have counted every one. Soon I will face my brother again, and this time the choice will be final: remain as I am forever, or find someone willing to pay the price for my freedom. What price? Freya asked, though part of her already knew the answer would test her in ways she was not prepared for. The curse can only be broken by one who chooses to see the truth and act upon it, regardless of cost. It requires a sacrifice of something precious, not life, though that would be simpler, but something harder to give. Trust, hope, the certainty that the world makes sense. Freya turned the runestone over in her hands, feeling its weight increase with each word Fenrik spoke. The ancient symbols seemed to pulse with their own light, visible even to her sightless eyes, as they responded to the proximity of their intended purpose. Magna gave me this, she said, holding up the stone. She said I would know when to use it. And do you? No, I mean? The question hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Freya understood that her answer would set forces in motion that could not be recalled, would commit her to a path whose end she could not see, but whose importance she could not deny. I know that you are not my enemy, she said finally. I know that my people are threatened not by a wolf, but by the man who made the wolf. And I know that some curses can only be broken by those willing to risk everything for the sake of what is right. Fenrik's massive head lowered, and for a moment she felt breath warm as summer wind against her face. Then follow me, daughter of Astrid. Let me show you the true threat that stalks our lands, and perhaps together we can find a way to end 21 years of darkness." As they prepared to leave the clearing, Freya cast one last look at the scarred tree that marked the boundary between worlds. Behind them lay the familiar realm of human concerns and simple choices. Ahead waited a confrontation with forces that had shaped destinies before her birth and would determine the fate of all she held dear. The silver hunting horn caught the moonlight like captured starfire, its surface etched with runes that predated written history. Freya turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of centuries pressed into its curves. This was no ordinary instrument, but a relic of the old ways, when the line between the mortal world and the realm of spirits was thin as morning mist. "It belonged to the first king of our line," Fenrik said, his massive form settled beside the dying campfire. "My great-grandfather used it to call the ancient spirits when darkness threatened the land. Grim stole it when he took the throne, thinking its power would legitimize his rule." They had traveled deeper into the wilderness throughout the afternoon, following paths that existed more in memory than on any map. Here, in a hidden valley where the old gods were said to still walk, Fenrik had shown her the true scope of his brother's ambitions. The evidence lay scattered around their campsite like the bones of fallen giants. Carved standing stones formed a circle in the valley's heart, each one inscribed with symbols that hurt to look upon directly. Between them, the ground was scarred with ritual circles and sacrificial altars where Grim had worked his dark arts for more than 2 decades. The very soil reeked of corruption, and even the hardiest mountain plants refused to grow here. "He has been busy since taking my throne," Fenrik observed, following her tactile exploration of the nearest stone. "These rituals are not just about maintaining my curse. He seeks to extend his own life, to bind spirits to his will, to reshape the very fabric of reality according to his desires." Freya's fingers traced symbols that seemed to shift under her touch, as if the carved stone was somehow alive and malevolent. "How many have died to feed his ambitions?" "More than I can count. He takes the innocent and the guilty alike, travelers who venture too far into his domain, warriors who challenge his rule, anyone whose life force might strengthen his workings. The curse that binds me was only his first great success. Since then, his power has grown beyond what any mortal should possess." The hunting horn grew warm in Freya's grip, responding to her proximity to the corrupted stones. When she lifted it toward her lips experimentally, a faint harmonic seemed to emerge from its depths, not quite sound, but something that resonated in her bones and made the cursed ground beneath her feet shiver with unease. "Careful," Fenrik warned. "That horn calls to forces that do not distinguish between friend and enemy. In the right hands, it can summon help from the spirit realm. In the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon of terrible destruction." "And which am I?" Freya asked. "Right hands or wrong?" "That," the wolf said with what might have been amusement, "remains to be seen." They had discovered the hunting party earlier that afternoon. 7 men from the Iron Hand clan, tracking through the ancient forest with the methodical determination of professional killers. But these were not ordinary hunters seeking game or glory. Their leader bore the mark of Grim's service, a brand burned into his forehead that glowed with sickly light and bound his will to his master's purpose. Freya had watched from concealment as they systematically destroyed everything they encountered. Sacred groves cut down for no reason but spite, mountain streams poisoned with foul alchemical brews, wildlife slaughtered and left to rot where it fell. This was not hunting but desecration, the deliberate corruption of everything pure and natural in the world. "They serve my brother now," Fenrik had explained as they observed the destruction. "Body and soul, bound by marks that burn away their humanity and replace it with his will. He has an army of such creatures, each one a person who once had hopes and dreams before he stole their capacity for independent thought." The realization had hit Freya like a physical blow. "This is what he plans for my people, for everyone who stands in his way." Yes, The curse that binds me was practice, a way to perfect the techniques he would later use on a much larger scale. Every village he conquers, every clan he subjugates, adds to his power and provides more subjects for his experiments. Now, sitting beside the corrupted stones with the silver horn in her hands, Freya understood the true scope of what they faced. This was not a simple matter of breaking one curse or defeating one enemy. Grim had spent 21 years building an empire of enslaved souls, and his ambitions reached far beyond the northern territories. "The horn can call the ancient spirits," she said thoughtfully. "What happens if we use it here, in the heart of his power?" Fenrik's great head lifted, his eyes reflecting the firelight like captured stars. "The spirits have no love for what Grim has done to these lands. They would answer such a call with considerable force. But spirits are not easily controlled, even by those with pure intentions. They might destroy Grim's workings, or they might decide that all human presence is corruption and cleanse the entire region of mortal life. Including us, very much including us," Freya set the horn aside and pulled out the runestone Magna had given her. In the presence of so much concentrated evil, it had grown cold as winter ice, its carved symbols barely visible even to her enhanced perception. But when she held it near the hunting horn, both artifacts began to resonate with harmonics that spoke of possibility and power. "What if we could combine them?" she mused. "Use the runestone to focus the horn's call, to ensure the spirits understand what we truly seek." "It might work," Fenrik admitted. "Or it might create a catastrophe that would make Grim's depredations seem mild by comparison. The old magic does not forgive mistakes, and it punishes presumption with terrible creativity." Freya stood and walked to the edge of the corrupted circle, feeling the wrongness of the place press against her consciousness like oil on clean water. Somewhere beyond these mountains, her village slept unaware of the darkness that reached toward them with patient, inexorable hunger. In other valleys, other communities faced the same threat, not knowing that their freedom hung by threads that grew thinner with each passing day. "Then we had better not make any mistakes," she said, turning back toward the fire where Fenrik waited, "because I do not think we will get a second chance." The wolf's answering growl might have been agreement or warning, but either way, it carried the weight of understanding. Tomorrow they would face choices that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everyone they had ever cared about. In her hands, the silver horn seemed to pulse with anticipation, eager to sound notes that would shake the foundations of the world. The transformation amulet hung from Fenrik's throat like a collar of stars, its surface rippling with an inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. As the moon reached its zenith above the corrupted valley, the ancient talisman began to sing a harmony so pure it made the very air shimmer with possibility. Freya felt the change before she saw it, her enhanced senses detecting the shift in Fenrik's life force as magic older than kingdoms worked its will upon his cursed form. The massive wolf began to shrink, his fur receding to reveal skin that had not felt moonlight for 21 years. Bones restructured themselves with sounds like distant thunder, and when the transformation was complete, a man sat where the wolf had been. Prince Fenrik was not what she had expected. The curse had preserved him at the moment of his transformation, leaving him with the build and bearing of a warrior in his prime. But his eyes, those carried the weight of every year he had spent in bestial form, every choice between humanity and hunger, every moment when the wolf's instincts had warred with a human soul. "The amulet allows me to take my true form when the moon is full," he explained, his voice rusty from disuse but unmistakably human. "It was my grandmother's gift, hidden from Grim's knowledge and proof against his curse, but only for a few hours each month." Freya found herself oddly moved by the vulnerability in his voice. The Wolf King, terror of the northern lands, spoke like a man afraid to hope for redemption he might not deserve. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Until dawn. Then the curse reclaims me, and I return to the form that has defined me for longer than I care to remember." He stretched muscles that remembered different proportions, working out the eternal ache of existing in a shape not meant for his soul. But tonight, we can speak as equals. Tonight, I can tell you truths that the wolf's throat was never meant to voice. They moved away from the corrupted stones to a clearing where clean water bubbled up from deep springs. Here, the taint of Grim's workings seemed weaker, held at bay by whatever force protected the source. Fenrik knelt by the water and cupped it in hands that trembled with more than cold. 21 years, he said wonderfully. 21 years since I could do something so simple as drink with human hands. Freya settled beside him, acutely aware of how different this felt from their earlier conversations. The wolf had been an ally, but this man was something else entirely, someone whose pain she could understand in ways that transcended the barriers between species. "Tell me about the night you were cursed," she said gently. Fenrik's laugh held no humor, only the bitter recognition of old wounds reopened. "It was supposed to be my coronation. Our father had died in battle against raiders from the east, and by right of birth and blood, the crown should have passed to me. But Grim had spent years preparing for that moment, learning arts that our ancestors would have called abomination. He traced patterns in the water with one finger, watching the ripples spread and fade. He came to my chambers the night before the ceremony, claimed he wanted to reconcile our differences. I was fool enough to believe him, to think that blood meant more than ambition. The wine he brought was laced with herbs that dulled my senses and opened my spirit to his workings. The transformation was agony beyond description," Fenrik continued. "Not just the physical change, though that was horrible enough, but the knowledge of what I was becoming. Grim made sure I remained aware throughout the process, that I would understand exactly what he had stolen from me." Freya listened without interruption, letting him speak truths that had festered in silence for 2 decades. She understood now why the wolf had shown such restraint, why a creature of legend had chosen subtlety over savagery. The man's consciousness had never truly left, only been buried beneath instincts that grew stronger with each passing year. "But there is more," Fenrik said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Truths I have never spoken, not even to the spirits that sometimes visit me in the deep woods." He turned toward her, and she felt the weight of his gaze like physical pressure. The curse was not meant to last 21 years. It was meant to be permanent, binding me forever in wolf form, while Grim ruled in my place. But on the night of my transformation, someone intervened. "Who?" "You." The word hit Freya like a physical blow, leaving her speechless and struggling to understand. Fenrik's voice gained strength as he continued, as if speaking the truth after so long gave him power he had forgotten he possessed. "You were barely 3 years old, sleeping in your mother's arms when she brought you to witness what she thought would be my coronation. But something in you recognized the wrongness of what was happening, the violation of natural law that Grim's magic represented. You began to cry, not the ordinary crying of a child, but something else. Something that resonated with forces your mother never dreamed you could touch." Freya's mind reeled as memories surfaced that she had never known she possessed. Fragments of vision and sensation, darkness pressing in like water, a presence vast and terrible being held at bay by something impossibly small and bright. Her own power, raw and untrained but responding to injustice with the pure fury of childhood innocence. "Your intervention disrupted the curse at the crucial moment," Fenrik explained. "Instead of permanent transformation, Grim's magic became time-limited. Instead of complete loss of human consciousness, I retained enough of myself to choose how the wolf would act. You saved me from true damnation, though neither of us understood it at the time." "That's why," Freya began, then stopped as understanding crashed over her like an avalanche. "That's why the curse can only be broken by you. Yes, the magic recognizes your spiritual signature, your connection to the working that bound me. No one else can unravel what you helped to limit." He reached out and gently touched her hand. "You have been my salvation since before you could walk, Freya Ragnarsdottir. The only question now is whether you choose to complete what you began so long ago." The transformation amulet at his throat pulsed brighter, and Freya realized that dawn was still hours away. Whatever power allowed him to take human form was growing stronger in her presence, responding to the same forces that had shaped his curse 21 years before. "The runestone will guide you when the time comes," Fenrik said. "But know this, breaking the curse will not be the end of our troubles. Grim has spent 2 decades building his power, and he will not surrender it willingly. When I reclaim my human form permanently, he will know. He will come for us with everything he has built. Then we meet him together," Freya said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "Man and woman fighting as equals against the darkness he has brought to our lands." "Together," Fenrik agreed, and, for the first time in 21 years, his smile held genuine hope. Above them, the moon continued its ancient journey across the star-filled sky, counting down the hours until transformation would claim him once more. But for now, they were simply 2 people united by purpose and bound by a shared understanding of what sacrifice truly meant. The amulet's light grew brighter still, as if responding to their resolution with approval that transcended mortal understanding. Whatever trials waited ahead, they would face them with the knowledge that redemption was possible if they proved brave enough to pay its price. The warlord's battle standard hung from the highest tower of Grim's stronghold, like a wound against the morning sky. Black ravens on a field of blood-red silk, the banner proclaimed the corruption of everything Viking honor once represented. Where their ancestors had fought for clan and kin, Grim's forces served only the dark ambitions of a man who had sold his soul for power that would never satisfy his hunger. Freya crouched beside Fenrik in the pre-dawn darkness, studying the fortress that had once been his rightful home. 21 years of Grim's rule had transformed the ancient seat of their bloodline into something that hurt to look upon. The walls themselves seemed to weep a substance that was neither water nor blood, and the very stones radiated a wrongness that made her enhanced senses revolt in protest. 47 branded servants within the walls, Fenrik reported, his wolf senses cataloguing threats with military precision. The amulet had reclaimed him at sunrise, but their night of planning had given them a foundation of strategy no amount of bestial instinct could have achieved. 12 more patrolling the outer perimeter, and at the center, your brother, Freya finished. Can you sense him? Like a canker in clean flesh. He has grown powerful beyond anything I imagined possible, fed by decades of sacrificial magic and the life force he drains from his enslaved followers. Fenrik's growl carried undertones of ancient pain. He is no longer entirely human, if he ever truly was. They had spent the hours since dawn reconnaissance the stronghold's defenses, mapping patrol routes and identifying weaknesses that might serve their desperate plan. The task felt impossible on its face, 2 against 60, including a sorcerer whose power had only grown stronger with each passing year. But impossibility was a luxury they could not afford. "The ritual chamber lies at the heart of the fortress," Fenrik continued. "That is where he maintains the anchors that bind not just my curse, but the enslavement of his followers. If we can reach it, if we can disrupt the workings there, we free them all," Freya said. 60 enemies become 60 allies if we can break the bonds that hold their souls. It was their only hope of victory, she knew. In direct confrontation, Grim's power would overwhelm them before they could bring their own resources to bear. But if they could turn his greatest strength into weakness, if they could restore free will to those he had enslaved, then the monster would face the very people whose lives he had stolen. Freya checked her weapons one final time, ensuring that everything was secure and ready. Her father's sword rode familiar at her hip, its blade honed to razor sharpness and blessed with oils that were said to bite deep into creatures of dark magic. The CX at her other side had been her companion since childhood, reliable and true in ways that transcended mere steel. But it was the artifacts they carried that would determine the outcome of this confrontation. The silver hunting horn hung from her belt, its weight both comforting and terrifying. The runestone rested against her heart, growing warmer with each step toward the stronghold. And around Fenrik's throat, the transformation amulet pulsed with power that seemed to strengthen in the presence of his ancestral home. "There is something else," Fenrik said, his voice carrying reluctance. "Something I have not told you about breaking the curse." Freya paused in her preparations, sensing the gravity in his tone. "What? The magic that binds me is tied to the royal bloodline itself. When the curse breaks, when I reclaim my human form permanently, it will also restore my rightful claim to the throne. Grimm's usurpation will become visible to every person in the kingdom, written in their very souls like law carved in stone." "That sounds like good news." "It is, and it is not. The restoration will strip Grimm of much of his power, but it will also drive him to desperate measures. A cornered sorcerer with nothing left to lose is perhaps the most dangerous creature in all the world." Freya considered this as they began their final approach to the stronghold's outer walls. The implications were staggering, not just personal redemption for Fenrik, but the overthrow of a tyrannical rule that had poisoned these lands for 2 decades. Yet with such stakes came proportional risks. "How do we break the curse?" she asked. "What exactly must be done?" "You must choose to see me," Fenrik replied simply. "Not the wolf, not the prince, not the legend or the victim, but the truth of what I am, in all its complexity and contradiction. The runestone will guide you, but the choice must be yours. And once made, it cannot be undone." They reached the base of the outer wall, where ancient stones had been mortared with substances that made Freya's skin crawl. This close to the source of Grimm's power, the very air felt thick and oppressive, as if reality itself struggled to maintain coherence in the face of such concentrated corruption. "The sewage channel," Fenrik whispered, indicating a grate that led beneath the walls. "It empties into the old dungeons, which connect to the ritual chamber through passages Grimm believes he has sealed." "Believes? I helped design those passages when we were children, playing at being heroes and villains. He sealed them with magic, but magic can be undone by those who know its weaknesses. They slipped through the grate into darkness that pressed against them like a living thing. The tunnels beneath Grimm's stronghold reeked of more than ordinary waste. Here flowed the spiritual pollution of his workings, the literal drainage of corruption that seeped from his magical experiments." Freya led the way through passages barely wide enough for Fenrik's wolf form, her enhanced senses navigating by touch and sound, and the subtle air currents that spoke of spaces ahead. Behind her, the great wolf moved with impossible silence, his padded feet finding purchase on stones slick with substances best not examined too closely. "Stop," Fenrik whispered as they reached a junction in the tunnels. "Do you feel that?" Freya extended her awareness, letting her consciousness probe the spaces around them. There, a vibration in the stone itself, rhythmic and powerful, like the heartbeat of some vast creature. It was coming from directly above them, through layers of rock and steel that could not entirely contain its influence. "The ritual chamber," she breathed. "He is working a great magic," Fenrik confirmed, "something that requires tremendous power and concentration. If we move quickly, we can catch him at his most vulnerable," Freya finished. They climbed through a shaft that led upward into the foundations of the stronghold proper. Here, the oppressive atmosphere grew so thick it was almost difficult to breathe, as if the very air was being consumed by whatever force Grimm was attempting to unleash. As they emerged into the lower levels of the fortress, Freya became aware of other presences moving through the corridors above. The branded servants went about their duties with mechanical precision, their souls so thoroughly enslaved that they responded to Grimm's will without conscious thought. But, beneath their magical compliance, she sensed something else, a deep yearning for freedom that no amount of sorcery could entirely suppress. "They want to be free," she whispered. "They have wanted that for 21 years, Fenrik replied. "Tonight, We give them the chance to remember what choice feels like. The vibration in the stones grew stronger as they climbed higher, following passages that existed more in Fenrik's childhood memory than in current architectural reality. Grim had indeed sealed these routes, but his magic was designed to keep things out, not to prevent escape from within. The wolf's claws found purchase where human hands would have failed, and together they ascended toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone they had ever cared about. At the final junction before the ritual chamber, Freya paused to center herself. In a few moments, she would face not just a powerful sorcerer, but the moment of choice that had been building since her 3rd birthday. The runestone at her heart pulsed with warmth, the hunting horn at her belt sang with barely contained power, and beside her a cursed prince prepared to reclaim his birthright or die in the attempt. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "we face it together." "Together," Fenrik agreed, and in his voice she heard the echo of the man he had been and the promise of who he might become again. Above them, the ritual chamber waited, and with it the answer to whether redemption was truly possible for those brave enough to pay its price. The cursed blade of binding hung suspended above the ritual circle like a fragment of captured midnight, its obsidian surface drinking in the torchlight without reflecting so much as a spark. This was the weapon that had carved Fenrik's fate 21 years ago, its edge honed not with whetstones, but with the concentrated malice of a brother's betrayal. Grim stood beneath it with arms raised in supplication, his voice weaving words in a metate, in language that predated human speech. Where once he had been merely ambitious, 2 decades of dark magic had transformed him into something that hurt to perceive directly. His skin held the pallor of something long dead, his eyes burned with fires that belonged in no mortal skull, and around him the very air writhed with energies that made reality itself seem negotiable. Freya and Fenrik emerged from the hidden passage into a chamber that defied the natural order. The walls curved impossibly inward while somehow remaining straight, the ceiling opened onto a void that was neither sky nor earth, and the floor beneath their feet felt solid, despite appearing to be made of crystallized screams. "Brother," Fenrik growled, his voice carrying across the supernatural acoustics of the chamber like distant thunder. Grim's chanting faltered for barely a heartbeat before resuming with renewed intensity. But Freya caught the moment of surprise, the brief flicker of something that might have been fear crossing his inhuman features. "The prodigal beast returns," Grim said without turning, his words somehow audible despite the continuing incantation. "And he brings the blind daughter of the woman who died, trying to steal what was never hers to take." "Astrid died, trying to end your abominations," Freya replied, drawing her father's sword. The blade sang as it cleared the scabbard, its steel somehow maintaining its luster even in this place where light went to die. "I come to finish what she started." "Do you?" Grim finally turned, and Freya felt the full weight of his attention like acid against her consciousness. "Or have you simply delivered yourself and my brother into my hands at the moment when I need fresh materials for my greatest working?" The ritual circle around his feet pulsed with captured souls, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, each one a life force torn from its rightful owner and bound to serve his will. But at the circle's heart lay something else, a darkness so complete it seemed to devour possibility itself. "The Eternal Gate," Fenrik whispered, and for the first time since Freya had known him, the wolf sounded truly afraid. "Grim, you cannot be serious. To open a permanent passage to the void will give me power unlimited by mortal constraints," Grim finished. "Power enough to remake this world according to my vision, to rule not just these mountain kingdoms, but every realm that exists or ever will exist." Freya understood now why the enslaved servants moved with such mechanical precision. They were not just controlled, but partially consumed, their life forces slowly drained to fuel workings that grew more ambitious with each passing year. The man who had once been Grim's brother was building a ladder to godhood from the bones of his subjects. "The blade," she said urgently to Fenrik. "That's what we need." "The cursed blade of binding was forged in the first days of the world," Grim said, apparently amused by their recognition. "It can cut through any magic, sever any bond, unmake any working, including the curse that has so conveniently kept my brother in bestial form. But it hangs beyond your reach, protected by wards that would destroy you before you could take a single step toward it." Fenrik began to circle the ritual space, his massive form moving with predatory grace, despite the supernatural forces pressing against them. "You always were too fond of explaining your victories before achieving them, brother. And you always were too trusting of those who claimed to care for your welfare," Grim replied. "Tell me, beast, does your blind ally know the true cost of breaking your curse? Has she been informed that freeing you will require her to take your place?" Freya felt ice spread through her veins as understanding dawned. The curse could not simply be destroyed, it required a host, a soul to bind in place of the one being freed. Magna had spoken of sacrifice, of choosing to see, regardless of cost. But she had not explained that the price was Freya's own freedom. "She knows," Fenrik said quietly, though his voice carried a note of pain that suggested otherwise. "The choice was always hers to make." "Was it?" Grim laughed, and the sound made the suspended blade vibrate like a struck bell. "How delightfully noble!" The beast and his keeper, each sacrificing for the other in an endless dance of misplaced honor. Freya raised the runestone, feeling its surface grow warm in response to the proximity of so much concentrated magic. Whatever choice lay ahead, whatever sacrifice was required, she would face it with her eyes open and her purpose clear. "There is another way," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not certain she believed them. "Is there?" Grim's attention focused on her like the weight of winter itself. "Then, by all means, enlighten us. Show us how the blind daughter of a failed hero proposes to unmake 2 decades of careful planning." Above them, the cursed blade of binding began to glow with malevolent light, responding to the magical tensions building in the chamber like a tuning fork struck by invisible hands. The crown of the Wolf King materialized above Grim's head like a constellation of captured starlight, its ancient gold inlaid with runes that spoke of choices that echoed across generations. This was no mere symbol of authority, but a test of worthiness. A crown that could only be worn by one who understood that true strength came not from power over others, but from the courage to sacrifice for them. Freya felt the runestone pulse against her heart as understanding flooded through her consciousness. The curse had never been about punishment, it had been about choice. Grim had created a trap with multiple exits, each one designed to corrupt or destroy those who would challenge his authority. But he had made one crucial error in his calculations. "You're wrong," she said, stepping forward despite the wards that made her skin burn with proximity to the suspended blade. "The curse doesn't require a replacement. It requires understanding." Grim's laughter faltered as the crown above his head began to flicker, its light growing unstable. "Understanding? What can a blind peasant girl understand that 21 years of study have not revealed to me? That some curses can only be broken by accepting them willingly," Freya replied. She raised the silver hunting horn, feeling its weight settle into her grip like destiny finding its proper channel. "That true kingship cannot be stolen, only earned. And that, the greatest magic comes not from taking, but from giving." The horn's first note rang out across the chamber like the voice of the world itself, calling to powers that had slumbered since the first fires were lit against the darkness. Grim's ritual circle wavered as ancient spirits answered the call, drawn by the purity of purpose that no amount of corruption could entirely suppress. "Impossible," Grim snarled, raising his hands to counter the spiritual forces that began to manifest around them. "I have bound this place with wards stronger than mountains, sealed it against any power that might challenge my work." "You have bound it against intrusion," Fenrik said, his voice carrying new authority as the crown's light began to shift toward him. "But you cannot seal a place against its own history, its own truth. This chamber was built by our ancestors to test the worthiness of kings. It remembers what you have forgotten. The cursed blade of binding began to descend from its suspended position, not falling, but floating down like a feather on still air. The wards that had protected it dissolved like morning mist, their power turned back upon the one who had created them. Freya felt the runestone grow burning hot against her skin as she understood what was required. The choice Magna had spoken of was not between Fenrik's freedom and her own enslavement, but between accepting the burden of kingship with all its responsibilities or rejecting it for the illusion of power without consequence. "Fenrik," she called, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the supernatural chaos erupting around them. "The crown is yours, by right, but only if you choose to accept what it means." The Wolf Prince looked between the descending blade and the crown that flickered between his brother and himself, like a candle in wind. Around them, the freed spirits of Grimm's victims began to materialize, their forms terrible in their beauty and implacable in their hunger for justice. "I choose to be worthy," Fenrik said simply, and reached for the blade. His claws closed around the hilt just as Grimm lunged forward, desperation finally overriding his calculated cruelty. But the sorcerer's power was already ebbing as the crown settled firmly above Fenrik's head, its light blazing forth with authority that brooked no challenge. "I choose to see you," Freya said, her words directed not at the wolf or the man, but at the truth that encompassed both. "Prince and beast, victim and survivor, king and protector, I choose to see all of what you are." The transformation that followed was nothing like the gradual change of the full moon. This was instantaneous and complete, the curse unraveling like a tapestry whose threads had finally found their proper pattern. Where the Wolf King had stood, Prince Fenrik rose in human form, the cursed blade of binding burning with cleansing fire in his grip. 21 years, he said, his voice carrying the authority of one born to rule. 21 years you have perverted justice and twisted honor to serve your ambitions. It ends now. Grimm backed away, his inhuman features contorting with rage and fear in equal measure. "You cannot simply undo what I have built." "The power I have gathered was never yours," Fenrik said, raising the blade. "It belongs to the people you stole it from, the lives you consumed, the hope you tried to destroy. I return it to them." The blade descended, not toward his brother's flesh, but toward the ritual circle that bound so many souls in servitude. When steel met enchanted stone, the resulting explosion of light could be seen from the highest mountains to the deepest valleys, a beacon of freedom that announced to the world that the age of Grimm's tyranny had ended. As the light faded, Freya felt the crown's power wash over the entire stronghold, freeing every enslaved soul and restoring choice to those who had forgotten what freedom felt like. The Unity Torque gleamed golden in the morning sunlight, its intricate braided design reflecting the intertwined destinies of two peoples who had forgotten they were meant to be allies rather than enemies. Freya turned the armband over in her hands, feeling the weight of promise it represented, not just the end of old conflicts, but the beginning of something larger than either clan could achieve alone. 3 days had passed since the breaking of Grimm's power, 3 days of healing and rebuilding that had transformed the once corrupted stronghold into something approaching hope. The branded servants, their souls finally their own again, worked alongside Fenrik's retainers to cleanse the taint from stones that had witnessed too much darkness. It was slow work, but thorough, the kind of restoration that could only be accomplished by those who understood that some wounds required patience rather than haste. "The last of the ritual chambers have been sealed," reported Bjorn, who had arrived with a delegation from Ironhold the previous evening. The old smith's hammer had been busy these past days, not forging weapons but crafting tools for rebuilding. "The corruption runs deep, but it is not beyond redemption." Freya nodded, her enhanced senses detecting the subtle changes in the stronghold's atmosphere. Where once the very air had been thick with malevolent energy, now she felt only the contagions. Clean mountain wind, carrying promises of snow and the distant scent of pine forests, reclaiming their ancient territories. "What of Grim?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Gone," Fenrik replied, his voice carrying the weight of complicated emotions. Even transformed back into humanity, even crowned with the authority that was rightfully his, he struggled with the reality of his brother's fate. When the curse broke and the binding circle shattered, he simply faded. Whether death or banishment, I cannot say. Perhaps it is better not to know. They stood on the battlements where the warlord's battle standard had once proclaimed corruption triumphant. In its place flew new banners, the golden wolf of Fenrik's restored house, alongside the iron hammer of Ironhold, symbols of alliance rather than conquest. "The southern clans have sent envoys," Fenrik continued. "Word of what happened here has spread faster than we anticipated. They seek assurance that the new king will prove different from the old." "And will you?" Freya asked, though she already knew the answer. The man who stood beside her bore little resemblance to the ambitious prince who had been cursed 21 years before. Suffering had tempered him like steel, forging wisdom from pain and humility from power. "I will try," Fenrik said simply. "That is all any of us can do. Try to be worthy of the trust placed in us, to learn from past mistakes, to build something better than what came before." Below them in the courtyard, former enemies worked side by side to repair damage that went beyond mere stone and mortar. The Iron Hand warriors who had served Grim through magical compulsion now labored freely to undo the harm they had been forced to inflict. It was, Freya reflected, perhaps the most profound magic of all, the transformation of hatred into understanding. "Your village will be safe," Fenrik assured her. "I have dispatched riders to Elder Magnus with formal guarantees of protection and trade agreements that will bring prosperity to your people. The isolation that kept you secure will no longer be necessary." Freya smiled at the thought of Magnus trying to negotiate with royal envoys. The old council leader would adapt, he always did, but she suspected the process would provide entertainment for everyone involved. "And what of you?" Fenrik asked. "Now that the wolf is gone and the king returned, what will the Shadow Walker do with her skills?" It was a question Freya had been pondering since the moment the curse broke. Her entire adult life had been defined by adaptation to blindness, by proving that she could fight and hunt and protect despite her limitations. But perhaps those limitations had never been limitations at all, merely different ways of seeing the world. "There are other kingdoms," she said thoughtfully. "Other places where legends walk and people suffer under the weight of curses they do not understand. Perhaps it is time to discover whether the lessons learned here can be applied elsewhere." "You would leave?" There was genuine sadness in Fenrik's voice, the response of a friend rather than a king. "Not immediately," Freya replied. "There is still work to be done here, still healing that requires patient hands. But eventually, yes. The world is larger than these mountains, and there are others who might benefit from learning that some monsters are simply people who have forgotten how to be human." She fastened the Unity Torque around her arm, feeling its weight settle against her skin like a promise made manifest. This would be her badge of office in the years to come, not as warrior or hunter, but as something new, something the world had not seen for generations. "A bridge builder," Fenrik said, understanding her thoughts with the clarity that comes from shared trial. "One who sees beyond surface appearances to deeper truths." "Perhaps," Freya agreed, "or perhaps simply someone who learned that the greatest victories come not from defeating our enemies, but from helping them remember who they truly are." As the sun climbed higher above the mountains, painting the restored stronghold in shades of gold and promise, Freya felt a peace she had not known since childhood. The wolf was gone, the curse was broken, and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten story, waiting for brave souls to fill its pages. Behind her lay a village that would always be home, a people who had learned to see strength in unexpected forms. Before her lay a kingdom rebuilding itself on foundations of wisdom rather than force, and beyond that, a world full of legends waiting to be understood rather than conquered. The Unity talk caught the morning light as she raised her hand to shade her sightless eyes, and for a moment it seemed as though she could see forever, not with vision, but with something far more valuable. Understanding, earned through courage and tempered by compassion, had given her sight beyond anything physical eyes could offer. It was, she thought, a fair trade for the darkness she had carried so long. Some gifts, after all, only revealed their true value when shared with those brave enough to accept them.